Now that we're experts at factoring, we're ready to apply our factoring to help us solve some quadratic equations. We're going to first of all solve 3x squared minus 5x plus 2 equals 0. Now the reason why this is called a quadratic equation is because it has a variable to the second term. Secondly, it's an equation because it has an equal sign. That's what we need when we're solving these equations, to look for that x squared and look for that equal sign. Then you know you have a quadratic equation. Now the method we're going to use to solve this equation, we're going to look for values of x that make this a true statement, is when we're going to use the factoring that we learned in the last few sections. Now, count the number of terms, 3. So we have a trinomial. We're going to factor, and in this one, I'm going to choose to factor this by the method of guessing or trial and error. The reason why I'm doing that is because the numbers aren't too large here. I know that the only factors of 3x squared are 3x and x, so I'll write those in. I know the only two factors of 2 are 1 and 2. Now, remember, using the trial and error method means I can either put the 1 and 2 here or the 2 and the 1 there. I have to try to guess by checking the products. So let's see, what would be a good guess? Well, I want to get a negative 5 in the middle, so I put the 2 here and the 1 there. Keeping in mind that I want a positive product and a negative sum tells me that the two signs of my numbers have to be negative, because a negative times a negative gives me that positive. And then notice they add up to, let's check, negative 3x, negative 2x. I got it, negative 5x. So my factor is complete. Now, remember that the zero factor property tells us this. If I have one number times another number that equals 0, either this one better be 0 or this one better be 0, because that's the only way we can get a product of 0. So let's write that out. Either 3x minus 2 equals 0 or the x minus 1 equals 0. Now our job is to simply solve these two equations. Let's solve the easy one first. X minus 1 equals 0, so x is equal to 1. That's one of our solutions. Let's look over here. 3x minus 2 equals 0. We're going to add 2 to both sides of our equation. 3x is equal to 2. And finally, to solve for x, we're going to divide both sides of the equation by 3. So x is equal to 2/3. So here are our two possible solutions for this first quadratic equation. X can either equal 2/3 or x can equal 1. Now, one clue here to kind of deciding how many solutions can I expect is look at the power. If the highest power is 2, we can have 2 or less possible solutions to our equation. If that was a 3, we would have 3 or less. So this is kind of a rule to keep in mind, that when we have a quadratic equation, we can expect 2 or 1 solutions. In this particular case, notice we got 2. X is 2/3, x equal to 1. Let's try another problem. Here we have x squared minus 6x plus 4 equals negative 8 plus x. Now, one thing different about this problem, as opposed to the first one we just completed, is you'll notice that the equation up here was set equal to 0. That's important because if it's not equal to 0, then we cannot use the zero factor property. So what we're going to have to do is move both these terms to the left-hand side of the equation. That's easily done because we're good at solving equations, aren't we? We're going to add 8 to both sides of our equation. When I add 8 here, 8 plus 4 is going to give me 12. And at the same time that I'm going to add 8, I'm going to subtract x. Negative 6x minus the x over here gives me negative 7x. So, in one easy step, I made this equation look like the one I had above. Again, let me explain what I did. I added 8 to both sides of the equation. 8 plus 4 is 12, and negative 8 plus 8 gives me 0. I subtracted x here, subtract x here, minus 6x minus x gives me a negative 7x. Once I've done that, notice I'm left with this pretty simple trinomial. These are the ones that we like because the leading coefficient is 1. So in order to factor this one, what we're going to do is we know this is x and x, and we play the little number game, remember, where we ask ourselves what two numbers have a product of positive 12 but a sum of negative 7. I'm sure you're thinking, as I am, of negative 4 and negative 3. Product, negative 12, just make a little check. Sum, negative 7, we're correct. Now, again, we're going to use the zero factor property, which tells us if this times this has a product of 0, then either this one or this one better be 0, or we won't have a product of 0. So let's set those equal to 0. X minus 4 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. Notice the nice equations we get to solve now. X minus 4 equals 0. Add 4 to both sides. X is equal to 4. Or, look over here, x minus 3 is equal to 0. So x could also be positive 3. So here are my two solutions to my quadratic equation. X is equal to 4 or x is equal to 3. Now what's important about using this method of factoring when solving quadratic equations is this. You must set up the equation equal to 0. So in other words, you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 before we can use the zero factor property. The more you practice, the easier it will become. Let's solve another quadratic equation. We're going to solve 2x squared minus 7x all over 3 is equal to 5. Now remember, the method that we have at this point of solving quadratic equations is to use a method of factoring and then to use a zero factor property. But in this case, we're a little bit different. We've got a fraction to deal with. Now most people don't like fractions. So what we're going to do is, if you'll remember, to eliminate fractions in an equation, we can multiply both sides of this equation by the least common denominator. Let's do it. Here we have a denominator of 3, and here we don't have a denominator, and I know you know that means our denominator there is 1. So what we're going to do is multiply both sides by the LCD, and in this case we know that happens to be 3. Now what's nice about that is the following. If I multiply the left-hand side of the equation by 3 and the right-hand side of the equation by 3, watch what happens. The 3's here divide out, and I'm left on the left-hand side of my equation with 2x squared minus 7x equals, and on the right-hand side of my equation, I have the product 5 times 3, or simply 15. So I know you'll agree that this equation looks a lot friendlier than the original one. Now that we have it in this form, we're not quite there. Remember, in order to solve an equation, a quadratic equation, using the method of factoring, we have to set our equation equal to 0. Right now we have 15 on the right-hand side of the equation. So to set our equation equal to 0, we're going to subtract 15 from both sides of our equation. And it looks like this. 2x squared minus 7x. Now when I subtract 15 from the left-hand side of the equation, it looks just like this, minus 15. And of course, 15 minus 15 give me 0 on the right-hand side of the equation. And again, the reason I did this is because I want to use what we call the zero factor property, which means that I have to have something times something equaling 0. Now that I'm at this point, what I need to do then is factor. What kind of factoring method am I going to choose? Well, I count the number of terms. 1, 2, 3. I have a trinomial. I check to see, do I have a special case of factoring a trinomial? No, I don't, because remember, in the special case, the first and the last terms were both perfect squares. In this case, they are not. So we're going to do the regular kind of factoring. Now, factoring trinomials, that is. Now, what I'm going to choose to do in this one, you can either do factoring by grouping, but what I'm going to choose is a factor by trial and error. The more you do trial and error, even though it may be a little difficult at first, the more you practice, the easier it will become, and you'll save a little space. Because if you'll remember, when you factor by trial and error, it takes only one line. If you factor using the method of grouping, it'll take you a few more lines. So your problem will end up being a little bit longer. So here we go, factoring by trial and error. I know the only choice I have for my first two terms is 2x times x. Give me that 2x squared. Now here's where it becomes a little tough. I've got negative 15. Two factors of negative 15 that come to my mind would be 5 and 3. One of them had to be negative. Now in my mind, I have to create there a negative 7. So let's just put them in any order. We can always erase them and change. So if I put 3 here and 5 there, and then notice I want to get a negative 7, so I'm going to make the product here negative and this one positive. Now how did I know how to do that? Well, it just, in my mind I'm thinking this outside term is going to give me negative 10. This inside term is going to give me positive 3. Negative 10, positive 3. There it is, negative 7. Again, it's called trial and error. If it does not work the first time, simply erase, switch the numbers, and get it to work. Okay, so now we're here and we're ready to apply the zero factor property. And that is, again, I have two numbers that multiply together to give me 0. Either this one or this one better be 0. So let's write that down. Either 2x plus 3 equals 0, or we have x minus 5 equal to 0. Now, of course, this is the easier equation to solve. Simply add 5 to both sides. So in this one, we get x equals 5. Over here on the left-hand side, the first thing we need to do is subtract 3 from both sides of our equation. So we get 2x is equal to negative 3. Again, that's subtracting 3 from both sides of my equation. And to solve for x, finally, all I need to do is to divide both sides by 2. So x is equal to negative 3 divided by 2, and that's because I divided both sides of this equation by 2. So what are my final solutions? Well, I have x equals negative 3, or I have x equals positive 5. So my solutions to this kind of complex looking quadratic equation are simple. X equals negative 3/2 or x equals 5. Now remember, when you're solving these quadratic equations by using the method of factoring, the first step is you want to get your equation set equal to 0, factor using whatever factoring method is necessary, use the zero factor property by setting each of these factors equal to 0, and then solve the remaining equation.